A waitress's innocent observation about a ring changes a millionaire's life forever. What she reveals will shake you to your core and prove that sometimes the most powerful truths come from the most unexpected places. The crystal chandeliers cast their warm glow across the marble floors of Grandview Manor, the most exclusive restaurant in the city. Tonight, like every night for the past several years, Alexander Blackwood sat at his usual corner table, the one that offered the perfect view of both the entrance and the kitchen, a strategic position he'd learned to value through decades of building his business empire. Alexander adjusted the platinum ring on his finger, a habit he'd developed whenever deep in thought. The ring had been with him for as long as he could remember, its intricate Celtic design catching the light as he moved his hand. Tonight felt different somehow, though he couldn't quite place why. Perhaps it was the unusual quietness of the restaurant, or maybe it was the weight of the phone call he'd received earlier that day. News that would change everything he thought he knew about himself. "Good evening, Mr. Blackwood," came a gentle voice beside his table. He looked up to see Isabella Martinez, one of the newer servers at Grandview Manor. She'd been working there for several weeks now, always professional, always kind, but something about her seemed different from the others. There was a depth to her eyes that spoke of experiences far beyond her apparent years. "The usual tonight, sir?" Isabella asked, her notepad ready, though she already knew his order by heart. Alexander had been coming to this restaurant for years, always ordering the same meal, always sitting at the same table, always maintaining the same routine that had become his anchor in an otherwise chaotic business world. "Actually," Alexander paused, surprising himself, "what would you recommend tonight? I think I'm ready for something different." Isabella's eyes lit up with genuine surprise. In all the weeks she'd been serving him, this was the first time he'd deviated from his usual pattern. "Well, the chef has prepared something special tonight, a dish that's not on the regular menu. It's a family recipe that was passed down through generations. Would you be interested in trying it?" As Alexander nodded his agreement, Isabella couldn't help but notice the ring on his finger. Her breath caught slightly, and she had to steady herself against the table. The intricate Celtic design, the way the platinum caught the light, the small emerald embedded at its center, it was impossible to mistake. "Excuse me, sir," Isabella said, her voice trembling slightly, "but that ring you're wearing, may I ask where you got it?" Alexander looked down at his hand, then back at her with mild curiosity. "This old thing. I've had it for as long as I can remember." "Why do you ask?" Isabella's heart began to race. She'd seen that exact ring before, held it in her own hands, watched as it was carefully placed in a small wooden box alongside other precious family heirlooms. "It's just, my mother has a ring exactly like that one. The design is so unusual, so specific. I've never seen another one like it anywhere." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge waiting to be crossed. Alexander felt something stir deep within him, a recognition that went beyond logic or reason. He studied Isabella's face more carefully now, noting the gentle curve of her cheekbones, the way her eyes reflected the light, the familiar warmth in her smile that reminded him of someone he couldn't quite place. "Your mother?" Alexander asked, his voice softer now. "Tell me about this ring of hers." Isabella glanced around the restaurant, making sure no other customers needed her attention before continuing. "She told me it was made by my grandfather, who was a jeweler back in Ireland. He made only 2 rings with that exact design, one for his son and one for his daughter. My mother's ring was supposed to go to her brother, but—" Isabella's voice trailed off as painful memories surfaced. "But what?" Alexander prompted gently, sensing the weight of the story she was carrying. "But her brother disappeared when they were young. The family was separated during difficult times and they never found each other again. My mother spent her whole life wondering what happened to him, wondering if he was still alive somewhere, if he still had his ring." Alexander's world began to shift beneath him. The phone call from earlier that day suddenly took on new meaning. A call from a genealogy service he'd hired months ago to trace his family history. A search that had led to more questions than answers. They'd mentioned finding records of Irish immigrants, siblings separated during their journey to America, families torn apart by circumstances beyond their control. "What was your grandfather's name?" Alexander asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Patrick O'Sullivan," Isabella replied, watching as all color drained from Alexander's face. "And my mother's brother, his name was Michael O'Sullivan." The restaurant seemed to spin around Alexander as he processed this information. Michael O'Sullivan, the name written on the birth certificate the genealogy service had found. The name that connected to the mysterious past he'd been trying to uncover. His entire life, he'd been Alexander Blackwood, adopted as a baby by a wealthy family who'd given him every advantage money could buy. But now, sitting across from this young woman, he was beginning to understand that his real name might be something entirely different. "Isabella," he said carefully. "What's your mother's maiden name?" "O'Sullivan," she replied, her own voice now shaking as she began to piece together the impossible coincidence unfolding before them. "Maria O'Sullivan." Alexander stood up slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him. He looked at the ring on his finger with new eyes, seeing not just a piece of jewelry but a connection to a family he'd never known existed. "I need to show you something," he said, pulling out his phone and scrolling through his photos until he found what he was looking for, a scanned copy of the birth certificate the genealogy service had provided. Isabella leaned in to look at the image on his screen, and what she saw there changed everything. The certificate clearly showed the name Michael O'Sullivan, born to Patrick and Catherine O'Sullivan, with a sister listed as Maria O'Sullivan. That's my mother's name," Isabella whispered, her hands shaking as she pointed to the screen. "Catherine was my grandmother's name. But how is this possible? You're Alexander Blackwood. You're one of the wealthiest men in the city. You can't be—" "I think I am," Alexander said, his voice filled with wonder and disbelief. "I think I'm your uncle, Isabella. I think I'm the brother your mother has been searching for her entire life." The two of them stood there in the middle of the bustling restaurant, surrounded by the clinking of silverware and the gentle murmur of other diners, completely oblivious to the world around them. They were suspended in a moment that would divide their lives into before and after, a moment when two lost souls found each other across decades of separation and pain. Isabella's eyes filled with tears as she looked at this man she'd been serving dinner to for weeks, never knowing that he was family. "She talks about you all the time," she whispered. "She never stopped hoping she'd find you. She never stopped believing you were out there somewhere." Alexander felt his own emotions threatening to overwhelm him. For years, he'd felt a profound emptiness, despite all his success and wealth. He'd built an empire, accumulated more money than he could spend in several lifetimes, but had always felt like something essential was missing from his life. Now, standing here with Isabella, he was beginning to understand what that missing piece had been. The weight of discovery hung heavy in the air as Alexander and Isabella stood frozen in their revelation. The bustling restaurant around them seemed to fade into background noise as they processed the magnitude of what they'd just uncovered. Alexander's hands trembled slightly as he looked at the birth certificate on his phone screen, then at Isabella's face, searching for any resemblance that might confirm what seemed impossible. "We need to sit down," Alexander said softly, his voice thick with emotion. This is beyond anything I could have imagined." Isabella nodded, her professional composure completely abandoned as she slipped into the chair across from him. Her manager, Vincent Torres, noticed her absence from her station and approached their table with concern etched across his features. "Isabella, is everything all right? You have other tables waiting," Vincent said, his tone professional but caring. He'd grown fond of Isabella during her time at Grandview Manor. She was reliable, hard-working, and brought a warmth to the establishment that customers appreciated. "Vincent, Isabella began, then looked helplessly at Alexander. How could she possibly explain what had just happened? How could she tell her manager that she'd just discovered her long-lost uncle was one of their most valued customers? Alexander intervened, his business instincts taking over despite his emotional state. "Vincent, isn't it? I'm going to need Isabella's undivided attention for the rest of the evening. I'll compensate the restaurant for any inconvenience this may cause, and I'll make sure her other tables are properly taken care of." Vincent's eyebrows raised in surprise. In all his years managing Grandview Manor, he'd never encountered such a request. "Mr. Blackwood, while I appreciate your interest in our staff, I'm afraid I can't simply—" "It's a family matter," Alexander interrupted, his voice carrying the authority that had made him successful in business. "A very important family matter that's just come to light." The sincerity in Alexander's voice, combined with Isabella's obviously emotional state, convinced Vincent to make an exception. He assigned Isabella's remaining tables to other servers and retreated to give them privacy, though his curious glances suggested he'd be watching from a distance. "Tell me about your mother," Alexander said once they were alone again. "Tell me about Maria. What's her life been like? Does she remember me at all?" Isabella wiped tears from her eyes, struggling to compose herself. "She remembers everything about you, Uncle. I'm sorry. Is it all right if I call you that? This is all so overwhelming." "Call me whatever feels right," Alexander replied, his own eyes glistening. "I've been Alexander Blackwood for so long. I'd almost forgotten that Michael O'Sullivan ever existed." "Mom talks about Michael all the time," Isabella continued, her voice growing stronger as she shared memories.
"She tells stories about how you used to protect her when you were little, how you'd share your food with her when there wasn't enough, how you promised you'd always take care of her. When the family was separated, she said you fought so hard to stay together, but the authorities, they wouldn't listen to children." Alexander felt a sharp pain in his chest as fragments of buried memories began to surface.
Images flashed through his mind, a little girl with dark hair crying as men in uniforms pulled him away, promises shouted across a crowded dock, the desperate feeling of being torn from everything familiar. "I remember," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I remember a little girl calling my name as they took me away. I remember promising to find her. All these years, I thought those were just dreams, nightmares from trauma. The Blackwoods told me I was an orphan with no living family." "They lied to you," Isabella said, anger flashing in her eyes. "Mom never stopped looking. Even when she immigrated here years later, even when she got married and had me, she never gave up hope. She hired investigators. She contacted missing persons organizations. She posted on every website she could find. She never stopped believing you were alive." Alexander ran his hands through his hair, his carefully maintained composure crumbling. "Where is she now? Is she well? Is she happy?" Isabella's expression grew somber. "She's not well, Uncle Michael. That's why I'm working here. Why I'm working 3 jobs, actually. Mom has been sick for some time now. The doctors say it's her heart, but I think it's more than that. I think it's the heartbreak of losing you, of spending her whole life searching for someone she thought she'd never find." The revelation hit Alexander like a physical blow. While he'd been building his fortune, living in luxury, his sister had been struggling, working multiple jobs to pay for medical care, carrying the weight of their separation all these years. "What kind of treatment does she need?" Alexander asked, his mind already racing with possibilities. "The best doctors, the best hospitals. Money is no object. Whatever she needs." "It's not just about money," Isabella said sadly, "though that would help tremendously. The doctors say she needs a specialist in cardiac surgery, but the waiting lists are so long, and the insurance doesn't cover experimental procedures. But more than that, she needs hope. She needs something to live for. She needs to know I'm alive," Alexander said with sudden clarity. "She needs to know I never forgot her, that I've been looking for her too." Isabella nodded, fresh tears streaming down her face. "When I go home tonight and tell her I found you, when I show her your ring and tell her you're here, alive and well, it might be the miracle she's been praying for. Take me to her," Alexander said immediately. "Right now. I don't want to wait another moment." "She's at Mercy General Hospital," Isabella explained. "She had another episode yesterday, and they're keeping her for observation. Visiting hours are over, but nothing," Alexander said, standing up with determination. "I own half the board of directors at Mercy General. If I want to see my sister tonight, I'll see my sister tonight." As they prepared to leave the restaurant, Alexander's mind was reeling with questions and emotions he hadn't felt in decades. How many nights had Maria lain awake wondering if he was alive? How many birthdays and holidays had she spent hoping he might walk through her door? How many times had she looked at strangers on the street, searching for any resemblance to the brother she'd lost? "Isabella," he said as they reached the restaurant's entrance, "there's something else I need to know. Your father. What's he like? Is he good to your mother?" Isabella's face darkened slightly. "My father left when I was young. When Mom got sick and couldn't work as much, when the medical bills started piling up, he decided it was too much responsibility. It's been just Mom and me for years now." Another wave of guilt washed over Alexander. While he'd been accumulating wealth beyond measure, his sister had been abandoned by her husband, left to raise a daughter alone while battling illness and poverty. The contrast between their lives felt like a cruel cosmic joke. "That ends tonight," Alexander said firmly. "Everything changes tonight. Your mother will have the best medical care available. You'll never have to work 3 jobs again, and this family, our family, will never be separated again." As they walked toward Alexander's luxury car, Isabella couldn't help but feel overwhelmed by the dramatic turn her life had just taken. Hours ago, she'd been a struggling waitress serving dinner to a wealthy businessman. Now she was walking beside her uncle, a man who could change her and her mother's lives with a simple phone call. But beneath the relief and excitement, there was also fear. What if her mother's heart couldn't handle the shock? What if after all these years of searching and hoping, the reunion she'd dreamed of proved too overwhelming? What if the brother Maria remembered was so different from the man Alexander had become that they couldn't bridge the gap between their separate lives? "Uncle Michael," Isabella said as they reached his car, "what if she doesn't recognize you? What if you've both changed too much?" Alexander paused with his hand on the car door, considering her question. "Then we'll build new memories," he said finally. "We'll create a new relationship based on who we are now, not just who we used to be. Love doesn't disappear just because time passes, Isabella. It just waits patiently for the chance to bloom again." As they drove through the city streets toward Mercy General Hospital, neither of them could have predicted that their reunion with Maria would uncover secrets that went far deeper than simple family separation. Secrets that would challenge everything they thought they knew about their past, and change the course of their futures in ways they never could have imagined. The fluorescent lights of Mercy General Hospital cast stark shadows across the polished floors as Alexander and Isabella hurried through the main entrance. Alexander's phone had been buzzing constantly during their drive, his assistant trying to reach him about urgent business matters. But for the first time in decades, work seemed utterly insignificant compared to what lay ahead. "Room 314, Isabella said breathlessly as they approached the elevator. "But visiting hours ended 2 hours ago. The security guards won't just let us—" "Leave that to me," Alexander interrupted, his voice carrying the quiet confidence of someone accustomed to making impossible things happen. As the elevator doors opened, he was already dialing a number on his phone. "Dr. Margaret Chen, please." "Tell her Alexander Blackwood is calling about an urgent family matter." Alexander's tone was measured but firm as he spoke to whoever answered. "I don't care what time it is. Wake her if necessary." Isabella watched in amazement as her uncle, a word that still felt surreal on her tongue, navigated the hospital's hierarchy with practiced ease. Within minutes, he'd spoken to 3 different people, each conversation building on the last, until he'd secured not only permission to visit outside normal hours, but also a private consultation with the hospital's chief of cardiology. "Dr. Chen will meet us in your mother's room," Alexander explained as they stepped off the elevator on the 3rd floor. "She's bringing Maria's complete medical file and she's prepared to discuss treatment options immediately." "How did you do that?" Isabella asked, her voice filled with wonder. "I've been trying to get the doctors to give me straight answers for weeks." "Money opens doors," Alexander replied, though there was no arrogance in his voice, only regret. "I should have been here to open those doors for your mother years ago." As they walked down the sterile hospital corridor, Isabella's steps began to slow. The reality of what was about to happen was finally sinking in. "Uncle Michael, what if seeing you is too much of a shock? What if her heart can't handle it?" Alexander stopped walking and turned to face his niece fully. "Isabella, I've spent my entire adult life making calculated business decisions, weighing risks and benefits. But this isn't business. This is family. And sometimes, the greatest risk is not taking any risk at all." They reached room 314, and through the small window in the door, Alexander caught his first glimpse of his sister in over 4 decades. Maria lay sleeping in the hospital bed, her face peaceful but pale, connected to various monitors that beeped softly in the quiet room. Even in sleep, even weakened by illness, Alexander could see traces of the little girl he remembered. The curve of her nose, the way her hair fell across her forehead. Dr. Chen arrived moments later, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and an efficient manner. She shook Alexander's hand warmly before pulling him and Isabella aside for a private conversation. "Your sister's condition is serious but not hopeless," Dr. Chen explained, her voice professional yet compassionate. "She has an enlarged heart, caused by years of stress and likely some genetic predisposition. The good news is that she's a candidate for a new surgical procedure that could significantly improve her quality of life. What's the bad news? Alexander asked, though he suspected he already knew. The procedure is expensive, experimental, and there's a waiting list. Her insurance covers basic care, but not the specialized treatment she needs. Without intervention, she has perhaps 6 months to a year. Isabella gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. 6 months? But the doctors told me she had more time than that. Her condition has deteriorated since her last admission, Dr. Chen said gently. The stress of her financial situation, the worry about her future and yours, it's taking a physical toll. Alexander felt something cold and determined settle in his chest. What would it cost to get her the best possible care immediately? Not eventually, not when insurance approves it. Immediately. Dr. Chen named a figure that would have been impossible for most families, but represented less than Alexander spent on business entertaining in a typical month. We could have her in surgery within days if the financial arrangements were in place. There's also a specialist in cardiac rehabilitation who could work with her long term. Done, Alexander said without hesitation. Whatever she needs, whenever she needs it. Money is no object. Uncle Michael, that's too much, Isabella protested. We can't let you. Isabella, Alexander interrupted gently. I've spent decades building wealth that I barely know how to spend. What good is any of it if I can't use it to save the only family I have left? Dr. Chen excused herself to make arrangements for Maria's treatment, leaving Alexander and Isabella alone outside the hospital room. Through the window they could see Maria beginning to stir, her eyes fluttering open as she emerged from sleep. Are you ready for this? Isabella asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alexander looked at his ring one more time, then at the woman in the hospital bed who had spent her entire life searching for him. I've been ready for 40 years. I just didn't know it. They entered the room quietly, Isabella leading the way. Maria's eyes focused on her daughter first, a weak smile crossing her face. Mija, you shouldn't be here so late, Maria said softly, her voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of her immigrant journey. The nurses will be upset with you. Mom, Isabella said, her voice trembling with emotion. I have someone here who wants to meet you. Someone very special. Maria's eyes shifted to Alexander, who had positioned himself where the light from the window would illuminate his face clearly. For a long moment there was only silence as Maria studied this stranger her daughter had brought to her bedside. Then, slowly, her gaze fell to his hands, to the platinum ring that caught the light from the hallway. Her breath caught in her throat, and her eyes widened with a recognition that transcended time and circumstance. Michael, the name escaped her lips as barely a whisper, filled with decades of hope and longing and disbelief. Hello, Maria, Alexander said, his own voice breaking as he stepped closer to her bed. I'm sorry it took me so long to find you. What happened next would remain etched in Isabella's memory forever. Maria's face transformed as if by magic, years of pain and worry melting away as she reached out with trembling hands toward the brother she'd never stopped believing she would see again. Alexander took her hands in his, and the moment their fingers touched, both siblings began to weep, tears of joy, relief, and a love that had never diminished despite the decades of separation. I knew you were alive, Maria whispered through her tears. I knew it. I never stopped looking for you, never stopped hoping. I never stopped looking for you either, Alexander replied, bringing her hands to his lips and kissing them gently. I just didn't know where to look. As brother and sister held each other for the first time in over 40 years, Isabella watched through her own tears, witnessing a miracle she'd dreamed of, but never quite believed possible. But she also noticed something else. The monitors beside her mother's bed were showing stronger, more regular heartbeats than she'd seen in weeks. Love, it seemed, was indeed the best medicine of all. The hours that followed the reunion passed like a beautiful dream. Neither Alexander nor Maria wanted to wake from. They talked through the night, sharing decades of memories, filling in the gaps that separation had created. Isabella curled up in the corner chair, sometimes sleeping, sometimes listening to stories about a childhood she'd never heard her mother describe in such vivid detail. Do you remember the boat? Maria asked, her voice stronger than it had been in months. The ship that brought us from Ireland? You were so seasick, but you still gave me half your bread every day. Alexander nodded, his eyes distant with memory. I remember you crying when they wouldn't let us stay together. I remember fighting them, screaming that I had to take care of my little sister. You were just a child yourself, Maria said, squeezing his hand. But you felt responsible for everyone, even then. Dr. Chen returned in the early morning hours with news that brought even more hope. The surgical team could begin Maria's procedure that afternoon, and the preliminary tests showed her heart responding positively to the emotional reunion, exactly as she'd hoped might happen. Family has healing power that medicine can't always explain, Dr. Chen told them. Maria's vital signs have improved dramatically since last night. Whatever happened here, it's given her the strength she needs for surgery. As preparations began for Maria's procedure, Alexander found himself experiencing emotions he'd buried for decades. Guilt gnawed at him. While he'd been building his empire, living in luxury penthouses and dining at exclusive restaurants, his sister had been struggling to survive, working multiple jobs, facing her illness alone. Isabella, he said, as they stepped into the hallway to let the medical team work. I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Of course, Uncle Michael. How bad has it been? The financial situation, your mother's illness, everything. I need to know what you've both been going through. Isabella hesitated, clearly uncomfortable discussing their hardships. We've managed. Mom always found a way to. Isabella, please, I need the truth. She took a deep breath before answering. There were times we had to choose between buying her medications and paying rent. Times when I worked 16-hour days between my 3 jobs just to cover the medical bills. Mom stopped eating properly because she wanted to make sure I had enough food. She'd pretend she wasn't hungry, but I knew better. Each word hit Alexander like a physical blow. Why didn't she apply for assistance? Government programs, charity organizations? She did, Isabella replied sadly. But the waiting lists were endless, and the bureaucracy was overwhelming. Mom's English is good but not perfect, and she was intimidated by all the paperwork. Plus, she was always so proud. She didn't want to be seen as a burden on anyone. Alexander felt his carefully controlled composure beginning to crack. While she was rationing food to pay for medicine, I was throwing away more money on business dinners than she made in a month. How is that fair? How is that right? Uncle Michael, you didn't know. But I should have known. Alexander's voice rose with anguish. I should have found her sooner. I should have tried harder. Isabella placed her hand on his arm. Mom never blamed you. Even on her worst days, even when the bills were piling up and her heart was failing, she never said a single negative word about you. She always believed you were out there somewhere, living a good life, and that made her happy. How could she not resent me? Because that's who she is. Mom has the biggest heart of anyone I know. She taught me that love doesn't diminish with distance or time. She taught me that family is about more than just being together. It's about carrying each other in your hearts no matter what. As they spoke, a commotion erupted from Maria's room. Alarms were beeping, and medical staff rushed past them into the room. Alexander's blood ran cold as he saw Dr. Chen working frantically over his sister's bed. What's happening? Isabella cried out, trying to push past the nurses to reach her mother. Dr. Chen emerged from the room minutes later, her expression grave but controlled. Maria's heart went into an irregular rhythm, but we've stabilized her. This sometimes happens before surgery. The stress of anticipation can trigger episodes. Is she going to be all right? Alexander asked, his voice barely controlled. The surgery needs to happen now, not this afternoon. We're prepping the operating room as we speak. As they wheeled Maria toward surgery, she grabbed Alexander's hand weakly. Michael, promise me something. Anything, Maria. Anything. Promise me you'll take care of Isabella. If something happens to me, promise me you won't let her struggle alone like I did. Nothing's going to happen to you, Alexander said firmly. You're going to come through this surgery, and we're going to have years to make up for lost time. Promise me, Maria insisted, her grip surprisingly strong for someone so ill. I promise, Alexander said, his voice breaking. But you're going to be fine. You have to be fine. I just found you. I can't lose you again. As the surgical doors closed behind Maria's gurney, Alexander and Isabella were left alone in the waiting area. The next several hours would determine everything, whether their family would finally be whole again, or whether Alexander would face the devastating loss of his sister just hours after finding her. She's going to make it, Isabella said, though her voice betrayed her own fears. She's fought for so long, Survived so much. She's not going to give up now. Alexander nodded, but privately he was making calculations he'd never had to make before. What if the surgery failed? What if he'd arrived too late? What if all his wealth and influence couldn't save the one person who mattered most? For the first time in his adult life, Alexander Blackwood, the man who had conquered every business challenge, who had never met a problem money couldn't solve, felt completely powerless. All he could do was wait, hope, and pray that love truly was strong enough to overcome decades of separation and suffering. The waiting room clock ticked away the minutes as brother and niece sat side by side, both lost in their own thoughts and prayers. Neither of them could have predicted that when Maria emerged from surgery, she would bring with her not just renewed health, but a secret that would shake the very foundations of everything Alexander thought he knew about his adopted family and the fortune he'd built. The surgery stretched into its 5th hour, each passing minute feeling like an eternity to Alexander and Isabella as they maintained their vigil in the waiting room. Alexander had paced the floors so many times that the security guard had begun to recognize his pattern, while Isabella sat clutching a worn photograph of her mother from happier times. "Mr. Blackwood?" A voice interrupted their anxious silence. Alexander turned to see his personal assistant, Rebecca Winters, approaching with an expression of barely contained panic. "Sir, I've been trying to reach you all night. There's an emergency at the office that requires your immediate attention." "Not now, Rebecca," Alexander said without taking his eyes off the surgical doors. "Whatever it is, handle it yourself or postpone it." "Sir, it's about the Blackwood Foundation records. Someone's been asking questions, digging into files from decades ago. They're specifically looking for information about your adoption, your biological family. The lawyers are concerned about—" Alexander's head snapped toward Rebecca with sudden intensity. "What kind of questions? Who's asking?" "A private investigator named Thomas Garrett. He says he's working for a client who believes there may have been irregularities in certain adoption proceedings from the 1970s and 80s. Isabella looked up from her photograph, sensing the shift in tension. "Uncle Michael, what's wrong?" "I don't know yet," Alexander replied, his mind racing. "Rebecca, what exactly did this investigator want to know?" "He was asking about the circumstances of your adoption, about whether the Blackwoods had any documentation proving your parents were actually deceased, about whether proper searches were conducted for living relatives before the adoption was finalized." A chill ran down Alexander's spine. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm saying the investigator believes some adoptions from that era might not have been entirely legitimate. The children might have been taken from families who could have been reunited. That records might have been falsified to make adoptions easier for wealthy families." Alexander sank into a chair beside Isabella, his world shifting once again. "You're telling me I might have been stolen from my family? That the Blackwoods might have known Maria was alive and looking for me? I don't know, sir. But the investigator mentioned he has testimony from former social workers who are willing to speak about questionable practices. He said he's been building a case for months." Isabella reached for Alexander's hand. "That would explain why Mom could never find any trace of you. If your records were deliberately hidden or changed, the Blackwoods are dead," Alexander said quietly, his voice hollow. "Richard died 3 years ago. Catherine 5 years before that. If they knew something, if they kept me from my family intentionally—" Rebecca shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, there's more. The investigator mentioned that some of these cases involved substantial payments to adoption agencies, payments that ensured certain children went to specific families regardless of other factors. Money," Alexander said bitterly. "It always comes back to money. Uncle Michael, you can't blame yourself for what happened when you were a child," Isabella said firmly. "If the Blackwoods did something wrong, that's on them, not you." Before Alexander could respond, Dr. Chen emerged from the surgical doors, still wearing her scrubs, but with a smile that immediately eased their fears. The surgery was successful. Maria's heart is responding beautifully to the repair, and her vital signs are stronger than we've seen in months. Relief flooded through Alexander so powerfully that he had to steady himself against the wall. "Can we see her? She's in recovery now, but yes, you can see her briefly. She's been asking for both of you." As they followed Dr. Chen toward the recovery room, Alexander turned to Rebecca. "Find out everything you can about this Thomas Garrett and his investigation. I want to know who hired him, what evidence he has, and whether the Blackwood Foundation is implicated in anything illegal. Sir, should I contact our legal team? Not yet. First, I want the truth. All of it. Maria looked fragile but peaceful in her recovery bed, connected to monitors that showed steady, strong heartbeats. When she saw Alexander and Isabella, her face lit up with a joy that seemed to energize her entire being. "Michael," she whispered, reaching for his hand. "I dreamed about you during the surgery. We were children again, playing in the fields behind our house in Ireland. How do you feel?" Alexander asked, studying her face for any signs of pain or distress. "Like I've been given a second chance at life," Maria replied. "Like God heard my prayers and brought my brother back to me just when I needed him most." Alexander squeezed her hand gently. "Maria, I need to ask you something important. When we were separated, do you remember anything unusual about the process? Anything that seemed wrong or suspicious?" Maria's expression grew thoughtful. "I remember the social worker seemed to already know where you were going. She had papers ready with your new name, your new family. It happened so fast, almost like it was planned in advance. Did she tell you anything about trying to keep us together? About looking for relatives who might take both of us?" "No," Maria said, her voice growing stronger with memory. "She said you were going to a good family, that you'd have opportunities I couldn't give you. But she never mentioned trying to find family who could take us both. When I asked if I could write to you, she said it would be better for both of us to start fresh, to forget the past." Isabella felt anger rising in her chest. "They deliberately separated you. They made sure you couldn't find each other." "It appears that way," Alexander said grimly. "But why? What did they gain by keeping us apart?" Maria struggled to sit up straighter, her eyes flashing with a determination that reminded Alexander of the fierce little girl he remembered. "Michael, there's something I never told anyone, something I've carried with me all these years." "What is it?" "The day they took you away, I heard the social worker talking to another woman on the phone. She said something about the O'Sullivan children being perfect candidates and that the Blackwood payment had been approved." Alexander felt the blood drain from his face. "She mentioned the Blackwoods by name? I was just a child, and I didn't understand what it meant then. But I never forgot those words. The Blackwood payment." The revelation hung in the air like a thunderclap. Alexander realized that his entire life, his wealth, his success, his identity, might have been built on a foundation of lies and stolen childhood. The family he'd thought had rescued him from poverty might have actually purchased him, deliberately separating him from the sister who had spent her entire life searching for him. "We're going to find out the truth," Alexander said, his voice filled with quiet determination. "All of it, no matter what it costs, no matter who it implicates." As Maria drifted back towards sleep, her recovery progressing exactly as Dr. Chen had hoped, Alexander stood by her bedside making silent promises. He would uncover the truth about their separation. He would make sure those responsible were held accountable, and he would ensure that his sister never wanted for anything again. But first, he had to prepare himself for the possibility that everything he'd believed about his life, his family, and his fortune might be about to crumble around him. 3 days after Maria's successful surgery, Alexander sat in the mahogany-paneled conference room of his corporate headquarters, surrounded by stacks of documents that painted a picture darker than anything he could have imagined. Thomas Garrett, the private investigator, had agreed to meet with him privately, bringing evidence that would shatter everything Alexander believed about his past. "Mr. Blackwood," Thomas began, his weathered face grave with the weight of his discoveries. "What I'm about to show you will be difficult to hear. Are you certain you want to know the complete truth?" Alexander nodded, his jaw set with determination. Isabella sat beside him, having insisted on being present, despite his attempts to shield her from whatever revelations lay ahead. Maria was recovering well at the hospital, gaining strength each day, but she had no idea about the investigation that was about to expose the foundation of their family's tragedy. Thomas opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been investigating irregular adoptions from the Sunshine Children's Agency for the past 2 years. Your case, Mr. Blackwood, is one of the most documented examples of what appears to be systematic corruption." He spread several documents across the conference table. These are the original intake records from when you and Maria were first brought to the agency. According to these files, there were 3 different families willing to adopt both children together. Alexander felt his stomach drop. 3 families wanted us both? Yes. All 3 were thoroughly vetted, financially stable, and specifically requested sibling groups. But here's where it gets interesting. Thomas pulled out another document. This is a payment record showing a wire transfer from Blackwood Industries to the Sunshine Children's Agency for $50,000. A massive sum for 1978. Isabella gasped. They bought you. They literally bought you. It gets worse, Thomas continued. I've interviewed former employees of the agency. According to their testimony, Richard Blackwood specifically requested a male child between the ages of 6 and 8, with no living siblings. When they told him about you and Maria, he initially wasn't interested. But something changed his mind, Alexander said, his voice hollow. Yes, the agency director, a woman named Helen Morrison, convinced him that separating siblings was routine and that it would actually be better for your development. She told him that keeping you from your sister would help you bond more completely with your new family. Alexander stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. They deliberately destroyed our family for money. Mr. Blackwood, there's more. Thomas's voice grew even more somber. Helen Morrison kept detailed records of her conversations with the Blackwoods. According to these notes, your adoptive parents knew that Maria was actively searching for you, even as a child. They received letters from the agency informing them that your sister had been asking about you, begging to know where you were. The room fell silent except for the sound of Isabella's sharp intake of breath. Alexander turned toward the window, staring out at the city he'd conquered through business, realizing that his entire empire might have been built on the foundation of a stolen childhood. Did the Blackwoods respond to these letters? Isabella asked, her voice tight with controlled anger. Yes, they did. Thomas pulled out photocopied letters. They instructed the agency to never contact them again about your biological family and to ensure that no information about your whereabouts was ever released. They threatened legal action if the agency failed to comply. Alexander felt something cold and hard crystallizing in his chest. They didn't just buy me. They imprisoned me. They made sure I could never find my way back to Maria. There's one more thing, Thomas said reluctantly. According to the agency records, your sister Maria tried to hire a lawyer when she turned 18 to help her find you. The lawyer contacted the Sunshine Children's Agency, and the agency contacted the Blackwoods to inform them of the search. And? Alexander's voice was barely controlled. Richard Blackwood made another payment to the agency, $25,000, along with explicit instructions that all records related to your adoption were to be sealed indefinitely. The lawyer was told that the files had been destroyed in a fire, which was a complete lie. Isabella stood up, her face flushed with righteous fury. While my mother was working 3 jobs and going hungry to pay for medications, the people who stole her brother were paying thousands of dollars to keep them apart. How is that not criminal? Technically, it wasn't illegal under the laws at the time, Thomas explained. Adoption agencies had broad discretion over how they handled cases, and payments to agencies weren't unusual. But ethically, morally, this was systematic family destruction for profit. Alexander turned back to face the room, his expression transformed by a cold determination that his business rivals would have recognized. Thomas, I want you to find every family that was affected by this agency. Every child who was unnecessarily separated from siblings. Every parent who was told their children were better off without them. I want a complete list. That could take months, possibly years, Thomas warned, and it would be expensive. Money is no object. Whatever it costs, however long it takes. These people destroyed families for profit, and they're going to be held accountable. Isabella looked at her uncle with admiration. What are you planning to do? I'm going to expose everything, Alexander said firmly. The Sunshine Children's Agency may be closed now, but Helen Morrison is still alive. Richard and Catherine Blackwood are dead, but their estate, their foundation, their legacy, all of it is going to be used to make amends for what they did. Thomas gathered his documents carefully. Mr. Blackwood, you should know that going public with this information will likely attract significant media attention. Your reputation, your business interests, everything could be affected. Let them be affected, Alexander replied without hesitation. I built my fortune thinking I was an orphan with no family. Now I know I was a kidnapped child whose sister spent 40 years searching for him. Every dollar I made was built on that lie." "Uncle Michael," Isabella said softly, "what about Mom? Should we tell her what we've discovered?" Alexander considered this carefully. "Not yet. Let her recover fully from the surgery first. When she's strong enough, we'll tell her everything. She deserves to know that she never stopped looking for me because she was right. I was stolen from her." As Thomas left with instructions to continue his investigation, Alexander and Isabella remained in the conference room, both processing the magnitude of what they'd learned. "I keep thinking about all the nights Mom cried herself to sleep, wondering if you were alive," Isabella said. "All the birthdays and holidays when she'd set an extra place at the table, just in case you came home. And I was living in luxury, never knowing she existed," Alexander replied, his voice thick with emotion. "The Blackwoods gave me every advantage money could buy, but they stole the most important thing, my family." "What's our next step?" Isabella asked. Alexander looked out at the city skyline, his mind already formulating plans. "We're going to create the largest family reunification fund in history. We're going to find every family destroyed by corrupt adoption practices and help them reconnect. We're going to make sure that what happened to us never happens to anyone else. And Helen Morrison? She's going to face justice, one way or another. Maybe not criminal justice, since too much time has passed, but she's going to publicly answer for what she did to families like ours." As they prepared to return to the hospital to see Maria, neither Alexander nor Isabella could have predicted that their quest for justice would uncover an even larger conspiracy, one that would reveal the Blackwood family's involvement in a network of wealthy families who had systematically purchased children from agencies across the country, creating a hidden legacy of stolen childhoods and broken families that stretched back decades. The ring that had brought them together was about to become a symbol of something much larger, a movement to expose the truth and heal the wounds left by those who had treated children as commodities and families as obstacles to be overcome with money and influence. 1 year later, Alexander stood before a packed auditorium at the National Press Club, preparing to deliver what would become known as the most impactful speech in adoption reform history. Behind him, a large screen displayed the faces of hundreds of families, siblings, parents and children who had been reunited through the O'Sullivan-Martinez Family Foundation, named in honor of Maria and Isabella. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander began, his voice steady and filled with purpose. "My name is Michael O'Sullivan, though for most of my life I was known as Alexander Blackwood. I stand before you today not as a businessman or philanthropist, but as a brother who was stolen from his family and a man seeking to right decades of wrongs." In the front row, Maria sat beside Isabella, her health fully restored and her face glowing with pride. The experimental surgery had been more successful than anyone dared hope, and the joy of reunion had accelerated her healing beyond medical expectations. She wore a simple pendant around her neck, a replica of their grandfather's Celtic ring design, now the symbol of their foundation. "The O'Sullivan-Martinez Foundation has accomplished something I once thought impossible," Alexander continued. "In the past year, we have successfully reunited over 300 families who were separated by corrupt adoption practices. We have exposed systematic fraud at 17 different agencies across the country. And we have established a legal fund that has already filed suit against the estates of those responsible for these crimes against families." The audience erupted in applause, but Alexander raised his hand for silence. "But our work is far from over. Today I want to share with you the story of one particular reunion that took place just last week, because it represents everything our foundation stands for." The screen behind him changed to show a photograph of an elderly woman embracing a middle-aged man, both crying tears of joy. This is Dorothy Chen and her son James, separated when he was 7 years old. Dorothy spent 43 years believing her son was dead because that's what the agency told her. James grew up thinking his mother had abandoned him. Last Tuesday, they held each other for the first time in over 4 decades. Alexander's voice grew stronger as he continued. Dorothy is 78 years old. She spent her life savings hiring investigators, placing advertisements, never giving up hope. James became a successful teacher, but carried the pain of abandonment his entire life. Both of them deserve better than the lies they were told. Both of them deserve the truth. He paused, looking directly into the cameras that were broadcasting his speech live. That's why today, I'm announcing the largest expansion in our foundation's history. We are partnering with law enforcement agencies in all 50 states to establish the National Family Reunification Database. Every person who was adopted, every parent who lost a child to questionable circumstances, every sibling who was separated, they will have a place to search, to hope, to find their way back to each other. The applause was thunderous, but Alexander wasn't finished. I'm also announcing that Helen Morrison, the former director of the Sunshine Children's Agency, has agreed to cooperate fully with federal investigators. She will be providing testimony about corrupt practices that affected thousands of families over 3 decades. In the audience, Thomas Garrett nodded approvingly. His investigation had uncovered evidence of a network of agencies and wealthy families who had essentially operated a market for children, treating families as obstacles to profitable adoptions. The legal ramifications would continue for years, but the truth was finally coming to light. But most importantly, Alexander said, his voice now filled with emotion, I want to talk about redemption. Not just my redemption, or my sister's, or the redemption of the families we've helped reunite. I want to talk about how love, real unconditional family love, can survive anything. He gestured toward Maria and Isabella in the front row. My sister Maria never stopped believing I was alive. She never stopped looking for me, even when everyone told her to give up, even when her health was failing, even when she had every reason to despair. That kind of love, that kind of faith, is stronger than corruption, stronger than greed, stronger than the people who try to reduce families to financial transactions. Maria stood up slowly, and Alexander's voice caught with emotion. My sister taught me that family isn't just about blood or genetics. It's about never giving up on each other. It's about carrying love across decades of separation. It's about believing in reunion even when reunion seems impossible. The audience rose to their feet as Maria made her way to the stage. Alexander helped her up the steps, and brother and sister stood together before the world, living proof that love could overcome even the most deliberate attempts to destroy it. There are families out there right now, Alexander said, his arm around Maria's shoulders, who are living the same nightmare we lived. Parents who don't know if their children are alive. Siblings who dream about brothers and sisters they barely remember. Children who wonder why they feel so incomplete despite being given every material advantage. Isabella joined them on stage, completing the family portrait that represented hope for thousands of others. To those families, Alexander continued, I want you to know that you are not alone. Your love is not forgotten. Your search is not in vain. The O'Sullivan Martinez Foundation will not rest until every family stolen by corruption has the chance to find their way back to each other. As the 3 of them stood together, the screen behind them displayed a live counter showing the foundation's impact. 347 families reunited, 52 ongoing investigations, 1,247 people currently searching for lost family members, and most importantly, a number that climbed each day, lives changed forever by the power of never giving up on love. 1 year ago, Alexander concluded, I was a wealthy man who thought he had everything. Today, I am a brother who knows he has everything that truly matters. Money can be stolen, businesses can fail, but family, real family, is eternal. Love is eternal. Hope is eternal. The standing ovation lasted for nearly 10 minutes. As the cameras captured the moment, millions of viewers around the world witnessed not just a story of reunion, but a testament to the truth that had been Alexander's greatest discovery, that the most valuable things in life cannot be bought, sold, or stolen. They can only be shared. Later that evening, as the 3 of them sat together in Maria's living room, the same small apartment where she had waited 4 decades for her brother to come home, Alexander reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't recognized your ring that night? Isabella asked, curled up beside her mother on the couch. I don't think it was coincidence, Maria said softly. I think love always finds a way. Maybe not when we expect it. Maybe not how we expect it. But love always finds a way. Alexander looked at the 2 women who had transformed his life and taught him what really mattered. You know what I've learned? He said. All these years, I thought I was building a legacy through business and wealth. But the only legacy that matters is love. The only success that counts is family. The only treasure worth having is the one we share with each other. As the evening grew quiet, and the three of them sat together in comfortable silence, Alexander knew that his life had been divided into two parts: the years when he was lost, and the years when he was found. And every day forward would be dedicated to ensuring that other families would have the same chance at redemption, reunion, and the healing power of love that never dies. The waitress who had noticed a ring had changed everything. But more than that, she had proven that the most powerful transformations begin with the simplest acts of recognition, caring, and the courage to speak truth with love.